So, hey everyone, I am Mia Eichel. I am a member of the PDX Global Shapers. We're a group of young people in Portland who are shaping social and environmental change in the city. We're taking applications later this fall, so you can apply to become a global shaper, and we meet twice a month and we put on activities like these where we determine a project that we'd all like to collaborate on and then um, organize that project and then usually do a report or some kind of um, closing activity. And then we do the same cycle all over again the next year. So this is our project this year. We decided to do a project based on Doughnut Economics, which is a development framework developed by Kate Rayworth in 2012 at Oxfam. And she developed this model as kind of a compass for leading the equitable and sustainable development um, of any, like from a city to a state to a country. It can really be scaled up or down. And it's called the donut because you have this ecological ceiling with the 9 critical earth processes that maintain the Holocene-like conditions that allow us to live on this earth. And then on the inside, you have the social foundation, which is like housing and water and food and all of the things that we need to survive. And then in the middle there is the sweet spot for humanity. And Kate Rayworth posited that, you know, GDPs and other benchmarks don't necessarily measure whether or not an economy or a society are meeting the needs of the people in the environment. So she proposed this new model, and it's been adopted by numerous cities across the globe, such as Portland, Brussels, Amsterdam, and there are a lot of pilots going on. So our project was basically to say, all right, so Portland has supposedly adopted this Doughnut economics model, but what does that really mean? And so we kind of set off to find people who were doing donut related work, and we've invited them to come speak here during these Doughnut Economics Shape Shops. And you know, there are a lot of people doing donut related work where they're working on one of these parts of the ecological ceiling or the social foundation, and maybe they don't know about the donut model. And that's why it's so helpful, is because it kind of brings all of these people doing this work into the same conversation. So we've been doing these shape shops since April. And our intention here is to have a community building and a knowledge sharing space for people who are doing this work, giving ourselves some similar vocabulary and a space to really talk about the landscape of what work is being done in Portland. And then at the end, we'll do an activity where we'll take all of the information that our guest speaker today will share with us, and we'll put it on a donut canvas. So we'll take all of the stakeholders and the problems and information and put it onto one document. And then we will take that information and put it into an article to share as kind of an update of the status of donut economics in Portland. And we're collecting all of that information from all of the shape shops, and this is the final one in the series. So this is kind of, yeah, what I just talked about, a little snapshot of the activity that we'll be doing. And that's the Miro link in the chat. So if you don't have a Miro account yet, please click on that and sign up. Now I'll introduce our speaker. So today we are so fortunate to have PSU's Assistant Professor of Environmental Science and Management, Dr. Melissa Haeffner. She'll present for about 25 minutes, give or take, and then we'll do a short Q&A afterwards, just if you want any clarifications on her presentation. And then we will go into the donut Miro board activity. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Dr. Haeffner.
Thank you, Mia, and thank you, Noreen and Mia, for inviting me today. I do have an error message that I cannot start sharing. Let me try again. Here we go. All right. Can you share, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, I can.
I'm clicking on present, but here we go. So like Mia was saying, I am in the environmental science and management department, but my background is actually sociology. And my mission in life is to connect physical and natural scientists with social scientists, to understand the human dimensions, and so that the physical and natural scientists can understand the human dimensions that are influencing their models. After all, paradoxes and unintended consequences are social in nature. Things don't often come out as predicted because people might perceive problems differently than scientists, and they might not behave in the ways that we think that they will. And we can see this play out right now in predicted scenarios with climate change, or how epidemiologists predicted COVID-19 spread. If we don't understand the people aspect, we are setting ourselves up for failure. So this is why I really like the Doughnut, and I'm very new to Doughnut Economics. I'm not an economist, but what is so important is understanding the social foundation and environmental ceiling. These are huge topics, and how I deal with so much going on in the world and with media is to try to focus on just one, and I focus on water and the intersection of water and social justice, which I call water justice. However, as you know, everything's connected, and I touch on other components as well. So this environmental ceiling, I'll start with this first. Of the 510 million square kilometers of Earth on Earth's surface, 30% is land and 70% is water, as I'm sure you all remember from grade school. And of course, only 3% of the planet's water is freshwater. And of this, 2/3 is captured in glaciers and polar ice, which we can't access. So we have a very relatively small amount of fresh water available, and it's not evenly distributed around the world. But we all live in a watershed. That's something every one of us has in common. When I say we all live in a watershed, what I mean is that we all live in a geological formation where the water is trying to flow to the lowest point due to gravity. There are 78 major river basins or watersheds in the lower 48 states. Generally, if you live west of the Rocky Mountains, the water will try to go into the Pacific Ocean. And if you live east of the Rocky Mountains, the water will try to go into the Atlantic Ocean or through the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic Ocean. Watersheds are divided into subbasins. The basin, if you are joining us from Portland, we live in the Columbia River Basin, in which every drop of water is trying to get to the Columbia River to make its way out to the Pacific Ocean. There's this cool app. Let me see if I can show it. There's a cool app called River Runner, where you can pretend that you are a raindrop and travel through your watershed. So I think we're about here. Okay, that's Malala, that's close enough. All right, we're a raindrop, we're falling, and oh my God, now we're in the river. Okay, and here we go. So if you're from this area, you might recognize some of these place names. All right, there's Portland. We just passed Portland.
This would be great to make a roller coaster out of.
That would be a cool roller coaster. I think it's going a little bit slow because of the sharing aspect, but okay, you get the point. Here we are going from the Columbia River out into the ocean. And so you can drop your pin on any point in this map and follow along and find out where your water travels to. So one thing I don't know what you guys have noticed from watching that app, but something that I noticed because I'm a sociologist is there were no people in it. And there wasn't even infrastructure that people build that changed the way that water flows. And so this is an aspect of traditional hydrology that I set out to change. When you take humans out of the equation, even if it's cool visual, and I get it, they're trying to make a point, but you allow people to disassociate yourself from nature. And when we separate ourselves from nature, it makes it easier to exploit and easier to ignore. But fundamentally, we are nature. We move water, we use water, we pollute water, and water moves us. Since colonization of the United States, of what is now called the United States, white settlers have constructed large-scale infrastructure that you see here: dams, pipes, sewers, conveyance, backed by large-scale funding. This costs a lot of money and big policy. On the one hand, this infrastructure allows us to turn on our faucets and have clean water come out. And on the other hand, the way it has been done through capitalism, it's displaced communities, it's changed the landscape, and it's created something we call waste. If you think of it, waste doesn't exist in nature. Nature recycles everything. In Oregon, we have 960 dams, most built before 1930 or in a period of time from 1950 to 1970. Why this is important is because dams are built to last about 50 years. So these dams are way past their birthday, so to speak, and they're aging and they need repair. We have 74 high hazard dams in Oregon. The estimated cost to fix just 7 of these will cost from somewhere between $36 million and $98 million. Just for those 7 dams. Add on top of this, conveyance system repair costing $890 million, drinking water transmission and distribution costing $3.7 billion, drinking water treatment repair, $1.1 billion, wastewater treatment costs $1.5 billion. Add that up, and that's what we need just to repair what we have, and not to, that doesn't even take into account what we have to think about for climate change. And if you're paying attention to the news, you know that aging infrastructure are problems that caused problems in Flint, Michigan, and problems around the United States and right here in Oregon. And that's why it's very important to follow what's happening with the infrastructure bill that is in Congress right now. But the logic of dominant capitalist paradigm, like what the Doughnut economics model is trying to present a new model of, is that old model focused solely on growth at the expense of people and the environment. And that traps us into this cycle that when something breaks, we try to build it back to the way it was before. Return to normal. Where have you heard that phrase before? Rather than evolving into new and innovative ways. Meanwhile, nature already offers us some of the best ideas for managing water. Luckily, if you're in Portland like me, you drink from the subbasin of the Columbia River. That subbasin is, there's a reservoir called the Bull Run watershed. And the Portland Water Bureau has spent years and a lot of money buying up all of the land surrounding that reservoir. And that protects it from development and pollution and ensures that we get some of the cleanest water in the country. I would say the cleanest water in the country. That's my biased opinion. But many of our cities in Oregon rely on snowpack for their drinking water. And snowpack is a natural water storage system where snow as water forms on the top of the mountains and melts slowly through the spring and summer. However, as temperatures rise due to climate change, that water will more likely fall as rain rather than snow, and we no longer have that natural storage system. But there are things that we can do about it, such as protecting those thick forests that control erosion and keep the snow that we have up there on top of the mountain for as long as we can. And luckily, there are a lot of scientists and policymakers working together on nature-based solutions. but I argue that we need more support and more funding. So, like I said, when I think about these issues, I think about the people living in these areas. And I asked two major questions. Are certain communities more exposed to environmental burdens than others? And do certain communities have better access to environmental benefits than others? These are two questions of environmental justice. In environmental justice, we don't define the environment as something out there, some nature in a remote area, but environment is where we live, work, and play. When we talk about justice, we talk about how some communities, usually minoritized and low-income communities, are negatively impacted by hazards in larger numbers than in their population. And that's called distributive injustice. But what we are also concerned about as well are if people are represented in government and to what extent that they can self-government and make decisions. Robert Bullard is called the grandfather of environmental justice. And in the late 1980s and in the 1990s, he was one of the first to conduct several empirical research studies that demonstrated that people of color, and especially Black people, are disproportionately exposed to pollution based on the color of their skin, regardless of their income. And not only is there a correlation, but there's a causation in which he proved that industries actually deliberately target these communities because they think that they won't fight back or they won't have the power to fight back. And that's called environmental racism. These are 9 points that he gave about what environmental justice is all about. And as you can see, it's not just about what we consider the environment, not just water and the air and food, but how they're all interrelated. In environmental justice, what we're really concerned about are that all communities have the right to a clean and livable environment. Communities with less power should not be targeted with the waste that other communities don't want. The green economy that we keep hearing about should take social justice into account and doesn't leave anyone behind. Health is inextricably tied to in the environment because if you're more exposed to pollution, you're going to have more health issues. However, people who are more exposed to pollution have more health issues, but they don't have that access to healthcare. They don't have the safe working places, the living wages, the health equity. We also need education open to all so that we can communicate these problems and so that communities who are faced with environmental pollution can do their own science and bring their own data that is credible and is heard by the people who make decisions. We need a good economy that can provide for everyone, and that includes food security, which is, again, is linked to water. Ed Quamps in the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla calls water the first of the first foods. Without water, you don't have salmon in the river, you don't have plants to eat, you don't have animals. So water and food are tied together. Also, environmental groups in the United States and environmentalism groups and conservation groups historically have been dominated by the white majority. And those environmental groups like the Sierra Club, like the Audubon Society, have done good things, but we need to center environmental justice in the environmentalist organizations. Climate change, when you learn about climate change, you probably hear about parts per billion greenhouse gases and PM 2.5, but it's more than that. Frontline communities are hurt first and worst throughout the world. Island communities are confronted with sea level rise and climate migration, and you see this all over the world, in the United States as well. Why frontline communities, why our communities of color and our low-income communities are so important, and that to think about in terms of climate change. And these are really downer topics, but we should also remember that there's a lot of empowerment around the environmental justice and climate justice movement, and we are stronger when we work together. So in my work, the thing what I think about is the thing about environmental injustice is that we often don't know where it's occurring until it's too late, until children have already died of lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, for example, until after people are exposed. So in my lab, and my students and I have a research question of where are there water injustices in Oregon? And we've begun to map water issues in Oregon with the hope that we can then correlate and identify potential issues of injustice before it's too late. And what we found are some clear indicators that there is water injustice happening in Oregon. We, with Street Roots right here in Portland, we interviewed people experiencing houselessness about their water values. And it became clear to us that COVID-19 played a significant role in access to water, actually in access. One participant told us, I don't know where to get free water right now. I used to sell newspapers at a grocery store, and they used to have a break area where they had a water spigot that you could go to get water for free, but you can't now. They closed their break area. And we see this throughout the city. Starbucks are closed, all these coffee shops. So where can you go to use the bathroom, use the sink, participate in daily hygiene? And then on top of that, with COVID-19, we're told to wash our hands and use more water, but it's more complicated for people experiencing homelessness that don't have piped infrastructure. That's what I call water affordability, and water affordability is linked to water reliability. This is a study by Dr. Meehan that she terms what she calls plumbing poverty and that lack of plumbing infrastructure. Our cities in the United States are designed to assume that you have a building, that you live in a house, and that house has pipes and working sewer. But that's not actually the case for over 1 million Americans. And Dr. Meehan studies this. She found that Portland, Oregon went from number 27th worst of plumbing poverty all the way up to number 2, the number 2 slot. What is going on in Portland, Oregon, that people don't have a working faucet, a working shower, a working toilet in their house? And plumbing poverty, like all hardships in the United States, is racialized. Native American households are 19 times more likely than white households to lack indoor plumbing. Black and Latino households are twice as likely as white people to lack indoor plumbing. And water reliability is linked to water safety. So Warm Springs, Oregon, on the Warm Springs Reservation, for the last 3 years has had water boil order after boil order, where they have to boil their water before they can drink it or bathe or cook with it. That means months at a time where they have to drink bottled water or boil their water before using it. Imagine boiling your water before taking a bath or bathing your kids, right? It's a huge inconvenience or huge expense if you're trying to buy that water. And so what's been happening in Warm Springs is that their infrastructure, that there are pipes that are so old and haven't been repaired that they have water main breaks that cause E. coli and bacteria in the water. Last year, the state government has actually approved $3.6 million to fix these pipes. And that's why I think it's so important for people living in the population centers of Portland and Salem, here where it's wet, where we might think that we don't have water issues, but we need to be aware of what is happening in the entire state, because this is where the voters are, the state government, capital, and the money is on the west side. And we have to be aware of what is going on in the entire state to ensure that our interests aren't the only ones driving policy, but that people are able to access clean water equally throughout the entire state. We might not have one water story in Oregon, but we do have shared water values. So what can you do? Number one, notice water. think about, when was the last time you used water today? Did you take a drink of water before logging on? Are you drinking water right now? We go through our lives without even noticing all the water access that we have, our toilets, our showers, the water we use for cooking. So first of all, just notice it. I have my freshmen do a water diary for a week where they have to note down every time they use water, and then they're surprised because they don't realize how much water they use in a week. Secondly, vote for nature-based solutions. Follow what's going on with the infrastructure bill. Hold your political officials accountable for making sure that those infrastructure dollars are going towards the future, not going towards repairing the traditional economic system. And lastly, volunteer, donate, apply. Mia said that there are opportunities to apply with the Shape Shop. And so there are a lot of ways to get involved. I'll check my time. Am I good on time, or should we go to discussion?
You can go, yeah, for a few more minutes if you want to go over some stakeholders. That'll, I think, lend well into the discussion.
Okay, great, thank you. I pulled out so many slides. I just want to tell you all everything. So I hope that all made sense. At the national level, there is a really great policy being discussed called LEWAP, which is Low Income Household Water Affordability Project or something policy. What it is that there's already an energy policy that helps low-income households pay their energy bills, but there's not one for water bills. That's up to the individual municipalities. So this would be a nationwide policy to help people pay their water bills, which are getting more and more expensive. And through COVID, we've seen that there are increasing number of households that are not able to afford their water bills. The WECR caucus, I was trying to save space by using the acronyms. It's the Water Equity Climate Resilience Caucus by Policy Link, the River Network Drinking Water Access Exchange, and the US Water Alliance are amazing organizations to follow. Also, I put this in the category of national level because sometimes we forget that Native American tribes are nation states, they're sovereign nations. So I wanted to point out that the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission is also a great organization that is very active around the Columbia River Treaty right now, which is being renegotiated. All those dams that we put in the Columbia River has been negotiated between Canada and the United States without Native American input. All the First Nations, as I showed you in the Columbia River Basin, the Columbia River Basin goes all the way up to Canada. And there are a lot of different actors and different First Nations and different Native American tribes that should be a part of that conversation. Also, there are a lot of tribes that are active at the state level. So the Oregon, before COVID, was putting together this 100-year water vision. And we're going around to different communities doing these listening sessions about what is our shared water vision, which is why I said we don't have one. We have a lot of them, but we have shared values. And in that listening session, the tribes presented to the governor, because this is a governor-led initiative, that they want to be involved. And not only that, but that it should actually be a 150-year water vision, because in the 7 generations model, where we think 7 generations back and we want to protect 7 generations forward, that would actually be about 150 years. It's also really cool to note too that once COVID hit, a lot of us in the water world thought that water was going to, like COVID was going to take over and people wouldn't be talking about water anymore. But the Coalition of Communities of Color and Verde and a lot of local organizations and communities of color actually pushed to get water back on the agenda. The Oregon Environmental Justice Task Force is a policy group. The Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board is a does a lot of funding of these projects. Oregon Environmental Council is very strongly involved in the Oregon water vision. Oregon Water Futures is led by Dr. Ale Reyes Santos, who brings in her focus, her research is about communities of color right here in Oregon and making sure their voices are presented in this policy. And Unite Oregon is another one. Here are a list of city and community actors. Again, the food, water connection. A lot of these folks are working on environmental justice issues. And with that, I just want to thank you all again and our funders. And I'll put that back up because I didn't go through it.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was really, really interesting. I love how you broke it down from national to state to local. I think this is such an important topic for us all to have some baseline knowledge about, and for you to bring in the social element and really putting people at the center of the discussion around water, I think is so important and so relevant for a lot of the policy and the work that's happening right now in Portland. So I would love to open it up to Q&A. Maybe we could do the Miro discussion and activity along with the Q&A, and people could kind of ask questions while we're all working on the Miro board together. Does that sound good? Awesome. So I will open up the Miro and share my screen and kind of walk everyone through what we'll be doing. Cool. So I think a lot of you have seen this before. We have the donut model, and we'll mostly be focusing on, the freshwater part, but the utility of this is that we can kind of put other sticky notes on other parts of the donut that intersect with water management and water justice. So I know Melissa touched on, for example, like the intersection between people experiencing houselessness and freshwater access. So you could put, gaps and problems. You can copy and paste, and then put here, COVID impact on water access, and put that into housing. So that's kind of how we'll do that. And the purpose of this is so that we can go in after and collect all of the different questions and gaps and stakeholders that we put on here, and use that to fill out our article that we'll be writing on this project. So while we're doing this, does anyone have questions for Melissa? We can just open it up to discussion. Or questions about the Miro activity. And if not, we can just start plugging in the different stakeholders.
Where was the slide deck?
Dr. Haeffner's or mine?
Oh, it wasn't one power deck?
No.
Hers.
Is there a slide that you'd like to see?
No, I was just curious for later so I can review.
I can email it to you,
Okay.
Mia and Noreen, or
I think you can email it to me and I'll send a recap email to everyone with the resources. And so I was also going to ask that question too, since just different ways to get involved in just the stakeholders. I think that'd be helpful to have for the rest of us. So good question, Michael. He beat me to it.
My question, Melissa, could you talk a little bit more about the policy that the Coalition of Communities of Color brought forth during COVID?
What I understand is that they didn't necessarily bring forth a policy, but that I can't accurately answer that question because I was not in conversation with them. But what I heard was that they were the ones that put water back on the agenda in front of the state officials. So while the state officials were arguing, going over the legislation, the state legislature, then lobby groups and organizations can talk to them about things. And what I've heard was that the communities of color and Verde were involved in making sure that water was back on the table and not ignored and letting COVID take over.
Okay. Okay, so that would be a good kind of stakeholder group for people who have maybe their fingers on the pulse on what's going on. And that's, is the CCC based in Portland?
They are, yeah. Yeah. And they have, they do research and they have, I don't think that they have somebody focused exactly on water, but they have somebody focused on environmental justice. And Verde has hired Cheyenne Holiday as their water justice coordinator. And she worked with LA Ray Santos on that Oregon Water Futures group. So there's a lot of ties and a lot of, I feel like a lot of energy of really getting like people of color, their voices heard in policymaking.
Yeah, that's great. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen because I have my notes that I want to reference so that I can add to this. Another question, Melissa, that I had was, I don't know how familiar you are of like the water portions of the national infrastructure bill, but will that result in funding being delegated to each state to improve their water infrastructure, or are there specific projects in the policy that like the federal government has decided to take on?
That's a really great question. And I don't have the answer to that. It's been changing. So like every minute it's been changing, and they pulled out the social infrastructure, the social services part of the infrastructure bill. And it's pretty complicated.
Yeah, it seems like it's changing a lot. What would be, like, in your opinion, more effective?
That's an excellent question. And it really, to me, it really means not just bringing people of color into the conversation, because right now we have procedural justice under EPA rules that people of color, low-income people, and people of all nationalities should be involved. They call it meaningful involvement in any regulation or implementation. However, meaningful involvement can be taken to mean that some agency has a public hearing at 1 p.m. with no childcare, or something when people just are, in a faraway place, like down in Salem, where not a lot of people can get to, a lot of people in the rest of the state. And that could be, and they had a public hearing, and they can say, well, we listen to people, we put the word out, but we need to do far more than that. And that, in addition to procedural justice, we have to get people absolutely involved, but we need recognition justice and representation justice. We need to elect people of color to decision-making bodies, and that's not just in government, but we also need to hire people of color in our water agencies and our water districts, you know, at the places who manage the sewers, sewage systems and things like that. I don't know if I answered your question. I forgot what your question was.
I think it did. I think that it's kind of like an intersecting issue where maybe it wouldn't just be that they're funding water projects per se, but just giving more resources to water management, you know, bureaus so that they can make more informed hiring decisions and plan for the future a little bit more.
Absolutely. And that's why that social infrastructure, all those social services were when they first proposed the bill, they were embedded. It wasn't separated, but that couldn't pass through, you know, the Senate and Congress, because we still have this idea that infrastructure is separate, like those tech fixes are these separate non-human things, and they don't have anything to do with social services, and that's BS. I think that's the technical term, excuse my language, but there isn't a separation, and we do. And I mean, in the 19th, just to give an example, not sort of with infrastructure, but in the 1970s, there was this push for more women in the water sector, which in water utilities, and from plumbers all the way up. And they brought in all these women and they trained them, and it failed miserably. It didn't work. Why? Because they thought that there was just one and done solution where they can just put women in these positions and walk away and everything would be okay. But as you could probably imagine, in these male dominated industries, those women were discriminated against, harassed on the job, and they, you know, weren't paid as well. And so why would they stay? And so you have to think about this, the social foundation and the environmental ceiling at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a perfect example of something that, like, if you're trying to apply this same model of just growth and, like what you were saying, return to normal and just maintaining the same system, but maybe sprinkling in diversity onto this existing system, that it's gonna fail.
Exactly. Or in the infrastructure language, sprinkling on some stream buffer zones or something, you know, like, or, you know, whatever it is, the new trendy topic. You can't just like add on something. You really have to look at the whole system together.
Yeah.
I'm having a little trouble sending you my slides right now, so I will email them after this.
No worries, sound good. I have to make a whole spiel of an email anyways, so I'll make sure to send that over to everyone. But if anybody's specifically wanting anything, I also have the link to your presentation. So if anybody wants a list of the stakeholders or something, I can definitely screenshot that to y'all or send it.
Oh, right. You have the link. So you have all the changes that I made today.
Yes, I didn't realize it was a Google slide. So yeah, I could totally just do that.
Yes. Yeah.
So I will get that as a PDF and get that to everyone. And Melissa, it's really funny that like when I was like a mentor for your class, it was only for 2 terms, which is really crazy, but it made such an impact on what I was interested in. And again, like you usually get assigned something randomly when you're a mentor at PSU, but I like still have like the come together from the river conservation. And just like, I was just so impacted by that. And like, even now I'm working with like Friends of Frog Ferry, which is an initiative to bring a ferry service to the Willamette. And it's going to be an all electric ferry and everything. So it's always been in my mind. And I remember it was such a great class. Like, I feel hopefully the freshmen felt that way as well. Cause it's like, whoa, water is such a big part of our life, and making sure that people have access to it and just the different ways it's being used and how influential it is. So it's definitely a theme that like I was already kind of interested in environmental, but then water specifically, and it's definitely influenced me later in life. And it's still interesting, like even at my other job, it's a long title, but the Watershed Council of Oregon, they're a client of ours and we do public relations for them. So I'm like still hearing about it. And so in your presentation, I'm like, oh, I know that organization. Oh, I know that one. And just seeing all the work that's being done. And again, it's great to see how connected everything is. And again, how we're talking about donut economics, how everything is connected.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. It's always nice to hear that from former students. And everyone must know that you were an amazing peer mentor and super organized and professional. And the students learned so much from you. But I'm really glad you're involved in the ferry, because I live up north, and every day I'm like, if only I could take a ferry to work, and that would save my life.
Yeah, it's definitely, and I mean, I might touch base with you later on that, because I only have like one person like who's a student that's in the St. John's area and at PSU, and because most PSU students don't choose to live up there because it's such a far commute. So we're definitely trying to get like advocacy for that. And I think the pilot project's going to start next year, from St. John's to River Place. So you'll be able to try that out.
I'll be on it for sure. I think there are faculty up north because it's cheaper to buy houses up there.
Exactly. I know. Like when I was at PSU, I debated on living there, but then there's no commute and I don't have a car. So it's like, yeah, I'm not going to take the 44 bus because that takes way too long.
It does. I've been trying to bike lately.
Oh gosh.
It's almost 8 miles.
Yeah, that's pretty far, especially if one of the bridges is down, then that's definitely a big deal. And I think that's something with the reason why I got this job as well, is because the riverways are so important, and like to utilize them and utilize them right. And then especially in emergency preparedness and like water resources, like thinking about like when the big one happens and the bridges like fall down, like what's going to happen then? How are we going to get places? And again, access to clean water during those times. We don't have a really good plan for that. And right before graduation, I think I told you about this, I studied abroad in Japan to learn about emergency preparedness. So coming back and being like, we got to fix this, we got to do something. So it's just, yeah, it's definitely different ways that we need to utilize and appreciate our rivers.
You couldn't have said it better. Yeah. And the Portland Water Bureau is looking at their pipes, because we have pipes that go under the river. And yeah, and the earthquake, those are going to break. And then the whole east side is going to be out of luck. That's why we should all have our 2 weeks worth.
Yep.
I was like, oh, 2 weeks worth. Yeah. I have my water bottle. I'll be okay. But as we've all seen with the wildfires, there are people who are isolated for 2 weeks. You literally need 2 weeks worth of water. But yeah, and also with the ferry too, I think that there's really something to be said for people like being on the water, and like the water is part of your day and it changes your relationship with your place.
Yeah. And I really do feel like you appreciate what you have. And just, yeah, again, most people live around the river in Portland, but you don't actually know how it is or like what to do with it. Or it's crazy that if you don't know how to boat or kayak, you really don't get to be in touch with it. And it's such a key part. I mean, the city was built around the river for a reason, because it's a natural resource.
Yeah, and the history of the river too, as a Superfund site and as a waste, a dump for a long time in our history, and people who have come together to clean up the river to make it swimmable. Like, so now we can actually go in the river even after all this time of polluting it is really impressive.
Yeah, I know. Like, so occasionally I'd like growing up being around the Willamette, it's like, oh, there's like the bacteria growing, don't go in the water and stuff. And it's just like, oh, that's kind of sucks, because it is our only body of water nearby, especially if some folks are used to having rivers you can always go into or oceans. And so, yeah, definitely trying to get out there and clean or help make sure. I mean, I've been going out to solve cleanups to make sure that we can clean the riverways. Or World Rivers Day was on September 26th. So I was out there cleaning South Waterfront.
Nice.
Do you know who manages the Willamette River? Whose responsibility is that?
It's all of ours.
Yeah.
There are several
Okay.
public and private entities. I don't think that there is one who's responsible.
Question about the, oh, sorry. Go ahead, finish your thought. Sorry.
Just because it's Superfunds, how Superfunds work are that the polluting corporation has gone out of business and the government has to take over. And so that's why the federal government is involved in some parts, but not all of it. And then some private willamette might own some land on the river as well, and they're responsible for that part. But I don't think there's like a Willamette River management entity.
Super
I could be
interesting.
wrong.
You would think that there would be, but I guess it makes sense if,
Yeah,
I mean, it's
I'll keep thinking about that. I could be wrong, but I don't know.
It's a
Sorry.
huge river, so like I could only imagine like
Yeah.
it'd be really hard to check it. Like if anybody ever wants something fun to do, try to go on the Willamette and just keep going south and see where it goes. And it's just crazy, all the little offshoots, like how many people are like affected by the Willamette. And I'm like out here in Salem right now, and it's just crazy. Like they're trying to get rid of some invasive species of plants, but then they're going to use herbicides. But then where does that go to? And I mean, yeah, getting rid of invasive species, but then how the chemicals spread, it's probably maybe not worth it. I don't know. I don't know the solution, but I also don't know that's probably not the answer either.
Well, it goes downstream, right? And out of sight, out of mind. So it's no longer Salem's problem. It's the next town problem.
Yeah. So it's just, yeah, it's interesting to see that initiative being done and just, yeah, how do you address it? And again, we're all connected by this one huge river. So.
Yanika, sorry,
Oh no, you're totally okay. You kind of went into what I was gonna ask, but I graduated from UP in 2016 and then moved overseas. But our capstone for my major was actually about the Superfund site. So once upon a time, I knew a lot about it, and then I kind of lost track. So I just was wondering if you knew like what the status of that was. I know it's all really slow moving and like getting community, they want to get input, but then it takes years. So I think the last I heard was like the 2018, it was open for the public and then they were closing, and I haven't heard anything since. So if you knew anything about that.
Well, actually, I do this activity with my students, and in my environmental justice class, I actually had people from the EPA Zoom in because it was during COVID. They Zoomed in and they presented their work, and it was a whole year ago. So, but they, I don't know if I can pull it up really quickly. But I could send you the report that answers their questions in much more detail than I could.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd be interested to see, what the movement's been since we wrote up our paper, 6 years ago. Hopefully there's been some movement.
Well, one thing I can share with you too, if I can share my screen again, some tools that I like to use. One is called, that I use with the EPA folks. In fact, like how I got connected with them is I couldn't figure out how to use their mapping system. So I emailed them thinking that it was some like bot or something getting comments, but they actually answered. And they're like, oh, wow, you're using our tool. We'll come to your class and talk about it. And Enviro Atlas and then Region 10 of the EPA, which is their headquarters is up in Seattle, but we're Region 10, I think 10. They also came to the class as Enviro Atlas and EJ Screen. And these are two mapping tools that have data layers where you can put environmental data layers on top of social data layers and ask questions about who lives near who lives near the Willamette River, right? Like who lives near these Superfund sites. So they're both very similar. They're both mapping tools. but they're really interesting. You can ask questions about, like, do people of color in Portland have equal access to green space? Spoiler alert, they don't. You can, so it's just a basic map, and it pulls data layers from GIS. And just last year, they started pulling in, they got data layers from Hawaii and Puerto Rico now too. So as you can see, you can look at water supply, runoff and flow, water use, all of these other environmental ceiling ideas. Sorry, I think my computer is being slow. And then with EJ screen, I think when you share your screen, it slows down. But in any case, it's the same idea. You can choose some of the common environmental justice data layers like PM 2.5, zoom in on Portland. Let's just add like EJ screen. Let's do, oh, super fun proximity. And then you can add demographic layers on top of that, and you can start exploring and looking at who lives proximate to environmental hazards. So those are some cool tools that I like to use in my class.
Those are so cool. Love finding new tools like this.
And I'd like to mention to all that it is 7. You can choose to keep working on the, gosh, Mia, your background is crazy how dark it got. But you can feel free to keep working on the mirror board. We'll be here for a few more minutes, but you're also free to leave at any point. You're in your own home, I assume. So, and I wanted to thank Melissa so much for coming to speak to us too. And it was really great and informational topic, and I feel it was really relevant, and I hope everyone else enjoyed listening too.
Yes, thank you very much.
Melissa.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
That's great.
Have a good night.
Thank you all. Yeah, thanks again, Mia and Noreen, for this opportunity. I can't wait for the report.
We'll send it to you.
I'll have my students read it for their assignment.
Oh, nice.
Oh.
Well, yeah, everyone keep an eye out on our social medias and websites. We'll try to keep an article combining all of our Doughnut Economics series. And so we can kind of have that as a nice little wrap up and as a resource for others. And then as well as we're also, as Mia mentioned in the beginning, that we're looking for new members for the hub. So you can check out more details on our website, pdxshapers.com, submit an application. We'll be ending that application towards the end of fall, but for the most part, you can see the details there. But we're looking for folks that are under 30 looking to incite local change around the Portland metro area.